For nearly 8 decades, a quiet but iron arrangement has governed the flow of global energy. It had no formal treaty, no signed declaration, only an implicit understanding forged in the years after World War II, when American naval power met Gulf Arab oil. The United States would provide security, and the Persian Gulf states would provide the world's most vital commodity. That arrangement held through revolutions, wars, and crises. It endured through the Iran-Iraq tanker wars of the 1980s, through the Gulf War, through the rise of OPEC and the shale revolution. It held until the last week of February 2026, when the world changed in ways that energy strategists had long feared but never fully expected to witness. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel initiated coordinated airstrikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear sites, and leadership, resulting in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. The strike was not improvised. It was the culmination of years of escalating pressure, failed nuclear negotiations in Geneva, a prior 12-day air conflict in June 2025 that left Iran's military infrastructure partially degraded, and a Trump administration that had concluded that diplomacy had reached its ceiling. The killing of Khamenei was not a side effect. It was a calculated decapitation, a signal that Washington and Tel Aviv had decided to fundamentally alter the strategic architecture of the Middle East. Iran's response was immediate, and it struck at the most vulnerable point in the global economy. Iran's Revolutionary Guards began issuing transmissions stating that ship passages through the Strait of Hormuz were not allowed, leading to an effective halt in shipping traffic. The announcement sent shock waves through energy markets, insurance companies, naval commands, and the offices of every energy minister from Tokyo to Berlin. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not merely a waterway, it is the jugular vein of the modern industrial world. The Strait of Hormuz is about 104 miles long, with a width varying from roughly 60 miles to as little as 24 miles at its narrowest point. It provides the only sea passage from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean and is one of the world's most strategically important choke points. During 2023 to 2025, 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas and 25% of seaborne oil trade pass through the strait annually. To put that in human terms, every day, supertankers the length of skyscrapers carry the lifeblood of the global economy through a corridor barely wider than some American counties. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, none of them can export the majority of their energy any other way. The U.S. Energy Information Administration is direct on this point. Most volumes that transit the strait have no alternative means of exiting the region. The International Energy Agency calculated that the closure thwarted exports of around a fifth of global oil consumption, averaging approximately 20 million barrels per day, most of which normally flows to Asia. 15 million barrels per day of that amount was crude oil alone. 4 operational pipelines currently have the capacity to allow an additional 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day to bypass the blocked strait, leaving a net shortage of between 14.5 and 16.5 million barrels per day. No war, no embargo, no hurricane, no financial crisis in the modern era had ever produced a disruption of this scale. Energy analysts scrambling for historical comparisons landed on only one frame of reference adequate to the moment, the 1970s oil shock, and even that fell short. The economic architecture of the crisis contained a particularly brutal irony. The Hormuz blockage also locked away approximately 4 million barrels per day in excess production capacity held by Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, the oil market's primary relief valve when crises strike. In the current emergency, that relief valve was unavailable because it too was trapped in the Gulf behind the Iranian blockade. The world had not simply lost access to Iranian oil, it had lost access to the spare capacity that the entire global system relied upon for stability. The shock absorber had been removed from the vehicle at precisely the moment the road turned treacherous. On the ground in the Gulf, the situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. Qatar halted liquefied natural gas production after Iran struck two of its gas facilities. Saudi Arabia suspended operations at its largest oil refinery after an Iranian drone attack sparked a fire. Iraq began curbing output. Asian refineries started cutting production runs. Qatar declared force majeure, a formal legal notification to buyers that it could no longer guarantee contractual deliveries because of the conflict. The cascading failures were unfolding faster than governments could respond. Every link in the energy supply chain was under simultaneous stress. Daily transits through the waterway fell somewhere between 90 and 95% since the conflict began, according to shipping intelligence firm Kepler. Hundreds of tankers were trapped in the Persian Gulf. The images were surreal. Massive vessels designed to move the world's energy, anchored and motionless, their crews watching the skies for drones while their cargo sat inert and inaccessible. Marine insurance costs in the strait had skyrocketed. Oil prices were threatening levels, analysts warned, that the world had never seen before. One KPLR analyst put it with quiet precision. If this dragged on for weeks rather than days, the ramifications would be immense. Iran had chosen its weapon deliberately. For decades, Tehran had waved the Hormuz card during moments of tension, as a threat, as a negotiating lever, as a rhetorical warning. But it had never fully played the card, not even during the brutal 12-day conflict of June 2025. Iran has not carried out repeated threats to close the waterway altogether since the 1980s, even during last year's 12-day war when Israel and the United States bombarded Iran's key nuclear and military sites. What changed in February 2026 was the assassination of the supreme leader himself. This was no longer a conflict over nuclear centrifuges or sanctions relief. This was an existential confrontation, and Iran played its final card. The United States' response evolved through a sequence of escalations that revealed the genuine complexity of reopening a waterway under hostile fire. President Trump announced that U.S. forces had conducted large-scale strikes on Karg Island, Iran's critical hub for Gulf oil operations, which he described as Iran's crown jewel, while specifying that its oil infrastructure had been spared, for now, as a conditional warning. The message was carefully calibrated. The infrastructure could be destroyed if Iran did not stand down. Trump gave Iran a 48-hour ultimatum to open the strait, then extended it by 5 days, then extended it again, a pattern of deadlines that reflected the genuine military and diplomatic difficulty of forcing open a contested maritime corridor against an adversary willing to use drones, mines, and missiles indiscriminately. On March 9th, President Trump announced his intent to seize control of the Strait of Hormuz. On March 19th, the United States Armed Forces began a formal military campaign to open the strait. By March 12th, Iran had made 21 confirmed attacks on merchant ships. The campaign to restore freedom of navigation had become a military operation in its own right, separate from but entangled with the broader air war against Iranian territory. The U.S. was now fighting on multiple simultaneous fronts, degrading Iran's military capability from the air, attempting to neutralize IRGC naval forces threatening shipping, and managing the diplomatic fallout with a coalition of allies who ranged from supportive to deeply ambivalent. France announced it was setting up a purely defensive escort mission for merchant ships transiting the strait, sending a dozen ships to the wider Middle East, with the French Navy vowing to deploy 2 frigates to escort vessels through the corridor. Britain, Germany, and Italy began working to support commercial shipping. The United Nations Security Council passed a resolution condemning Iran's attacks on its neighbors and calling on Tehran to halt its threats to vessels in the strait. The coalition was real but fragile. Japan ruled out sending naval ships. Australia initially declined before eventually joining a 22-nation pledge to plan for an eventual escort mission. The politics of the crisis revealed that even among Washington's closest partners, the line between supporting an ally and being drawn into an open-ended war at sea was a line many governments were reluctant to cross. The crisis had effectively dismantled the long-standing U.S.-Saudi oil for security bargain that has endured in various forms since 1945. Under the Trump administration, the U.S. security force in the Gulf had transitioned from protector of trade to instigator of war. As a result, U.S. military bases in the Gulf had become Iran's key targets. The arrangement that had guaranteed stable energy flows for 80 years, American military power guaranteeing the safe passage of Gulf oil to global markets, had not merely been tested. It had been structurally inverted. The protector had become the combatant, and the waterway it had long protected was now the battlefield. The deeper strategic question haunting every capital from Riyadh to Beijing was not merely whether the strait would reopen, but what kind of world would exist when it did. China, which imports the majority of its oil from the Gulf, found itself watching the disruption of its most critical supply chain, while simultaneously being unwilling to openly confront Washington. Some shipping and insurance experts did not expect the situation in the Strait of Hormuz to return to normal until the war wound down significantly. For Asian economies structurally dependent on Gulf energy, that uncertainty was not an abstraction. It was a direct threat to industrial output, food security, and social stability. In a late development, Tehran agreed to facilitate and expedite humanitarian aid through the Strait of Hormuz in a communication through Iran's ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva, the first breakthrough at the choke point after nearly a month of war. While markets and governments had focused on blocked oil and gas, the restriction of fertilizer had also begun threatening farming and food security around the world. The humanitarian carve-out was a signal, a narrow opening that suggested Iran understood the limits of full closure, but was not yet ready to stand down. The strait remained effectively shut to commercial oil shipping, even as diplomatic contacts multiplied behind closed doors. What the world was witnessing in the spring of 2026 was not simply a military conflict. It was a fundamental stress test of the global energy order, a system built on the assumption that the Strait of Hormuz would remain open, that American naval dominance would ensure it, and that the Gulf states would remain stable suppliers no matter what conflicts raged on their periphery. All three of those assumptions had been simultaneously invalidated. The choke point had been closed. American military power, formidable as it was proving that forcing open a maritime corridor against a determined adversary with drones, mines, and missiles was a far more complex undertaking than airstrikes on fixed targets. And the Gulf states themselves, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, had become theaters of Iranian retaliation, their refineries burning, their skies filled with intercept trails. History has a way of marking the moments when one era ends and another begins, moments that are only fully visible in retrospect. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the September 11th attacks, the 2008 financial crisis. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz in the spring of 2026 may well belong in that company. Not because the strait will remain closed forever, or because the global oil trade cannot ultimately find new pathways, but because the architecture of certainty that underpinned 80 years of energy security had cracked in ways that cannot simply be repaired by a ceasefire. The question that now faces every government, every energy company, and every nation that depends on the free movement of oil through that narrow corridor is not when the strait reopens. It is what kind of world, with what new rules, what new alignments, and what new vulnerabilities exists on the other side.